This is the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm your host, Richard McColl, here in Bogota, 2,600 meters closer to the stars. Our very special guest this week is in New Hampshire. She may be the first person from New Hampshire that we've had on the podcast over these 13 years or more that we've been out there. Can I introduce you all to Jessica M. Lepler, who is the Associate Professor of History at the University of New Hampshire.
Hey, it's so nice to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm sitting here in the sun. It's morning here in Bogota, and you're sitting in the snow, I think, in New Hampshire. So where would you rather be?
Definitely in the sun. I am definitely a warm weather person, but no, we get quite a lot of snow in the winter here in New Hampshire.
Oh, of course you do indeed. But, you know, it does make for great Christmas holidays with that Christmassy feel, with everything around it, even into the new year when you're, you know, maybe you're growing a bit tired of it and it's brown and slushy. It still makes for great ambience. But, you know, I'd still sooner be here.
Yeah, I think it's April when there's still a big pile of snow in the parking lot at the University of New Hampshire that I am like, really? Do we still need this snow?
Yeah,
Could it go now?
That solid brown one that you still don't know because of all the dirt. This is true. Well, listen, first of all, a shout out to Gavin O'Toole at the Latin American Review of Books, because were it not for Gavin's write-up of your book, a very good write-up, I would not have known about it. And I am very happy that we were able to get in touch. So you have this new book out. It's called Canal Dreamers, The Epic Quest to Connect the Atlantic and Pacific in the Age of Revolutions. So being that the kind of geek I am when it comes to history and Central and South America, I immediately bought the book and then got in touch, and I've read it and I enjoyed it immensely. Perhaps this is the moment, Jess, that you can say, what is your book about in a nutshell?
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for buying the book. And I am very grateful for reviews. It's really helpful in spreading the word about this work I've done, which is about 1820s attempts to build a canal across Lake Nicaragua. And in the 1820s, it was a period towards the end of what we often call the Age of Revolutions, which basically launched around 1776 with the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And we don't know exactly when it ends. There's a lot of dispute among historians about when it ends, but this is the moment that this sort of spirit of independence reaches Central America. And US and British investors are also sort of really interested in canals. The Erie Canal was just built. The Caledonian Canal, which connects the North Sea and the Atlantic, was just built in Scotland. And so they look at the map of the world and they say, oh, we need a canal here, right here in the center where the land between North and South America gets pretty narrow. And so this book is about the quest for that. And it takes all sorts of turns and focuses on a lot of really fascinating people.
Well, it really does, because that's what I come away with. You know, I knew the stories about Nicaragua. And of course, you know, for those of us who are here and observers of the area or look at the politics and so on, there's always talk about it, especially even more contemporary. You know, there's I don't know if it's pie in the sky claim that the Chinese are going to build a new canal that will connect Lake Nicaragua and then across and so on. But this is the first. This is really before anything happens, as you're looking at the 1820s. And let's put it into context. The Panama Canal was opened in 1914. So that was a later project. And so we've already got this era of independence taking place in Central America. And so am I not wrong in thinking that the whole area was referred to as like the Kingdom of Guatemala at the time? Is that right? Or is it already splitting off?
So in colonial Spanish era, this was the Kingdom of Guatemala, or the Captaincy General of Guatemala. And it fell under the province of New Spain, which was what is now Mexico. But in the early 1820s, Mexico declares independence, and then this sort of subregion declares independence shortly afterwards. And then Mexico annexes the new national independent Mexico annexes this sort of Central American region. And then the Mexican government is in flux and it becomes an empire, and eventually the emperor gets deposed. And these states that become the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, they separate and try to form their own central government over the 5 provinces. The old Captaincy General of Guatemala also included some parts that stayed in Mexico. So it's a little bit slightly different geographically, but mostly it's the 5 Central American countries, not Panama, which is part of Gran Colombia.
Yeah. And the capital with them was where Guatemala City is.
That's right.
That's it.
And in fact, it used the same buildings that the old colonial capital used.
Right down there in zones 1 and 2 of Guatemala City, which is now a place where you can wander a little bit, but not so much either. How interesting. I spent a year in Guatemala in another lifetime, and it was again formative for my upbringing and so on. And I have been down in the archives down there and so on to try and look up some police records of someone or other. It's not very ordered. How did you get? I mean, because there is information that comes out of your eyeballs in this book about people and characters and corruption and lies. I mean, where did you find all of this information?
Well, I've been working on this for over 20 years. So a lot of places is the answer. I gathered materials. I didn't actually go to everywhere, but I gathered materials from 50 archives in 10 countries across 3 continents. So yes, a lot. And in Guatemala in particular, I worked with a researcher there who went to the archive. There is a set of papers related to the Federal Republic of Central America, which is the short-lived government that's ruling Central America in this period. And so he did a lot of digging for me and sent me photographs of materials that he found there. But to be honest, those materials, they were valuable, but the print culture that came out of Central America, actually in the 20th century, that reproduced the papers of important leaders from this period, and each separate Central American nation did this project. My library at the University of New Hampshire, Interlibrary, loaned those materials for me. And so that was, especially during COVID, a way I could gather a lot. I also worked extensively in British archives and US archives. So it's I worked with a family too that had family papers. Like it was really fun to gather the materials for this book.
That's really cool. Can I ask who the family was? I mean, because you're looking at someone whose, I guess, ancestry dates back into this history.
Exactly. So the person who wins the canal contract, because the new Republic of Central America actually does award a contract to an American company. They don't know exactly who is running that company, but the man behind it is a man named Aaron Palmer, and his family were Quakers. His father died young, however, and his mother remarried, and she actually remarried a man named Mariano Velasquez de la Cadena, who was from Mexico. And he was one of these very elite Mexican men who got stranded in the United States during the Wars of Independence in Mexico. He became Columbia University's first Spanish language professor. So I traced his family out and I found his descendants and I worked with them. And one of the descendants lives in Spain and has Mariano Velasquez de la Cadena's letters. He and Aaron Palmer's mother ran a boarding house, a kind of school/boarding school for boys from the former Spanish Empire in the 1820s. And so they have letters home to their parents and letters back from the parents.
See, really cool. This makes the hair on my arm stand up. It gives me goosebumps. As like someone who loves history, you are uncovering something that was known only to, to specific members of a family. That must be cool. And so I guess they scanned these letters and let you read them. And were they beautifully written in cursive and so on?
They're beautifully written in Spanish cursive. Yeah. So the other piece of me being able to do this research is I'm very lucky at the University of New Hampshire. We have a wonderful graduate program, doctoral program, and a doctoral student, entered the program in the midst of COVID, the COVID era, and he was fluent in Spanish and wanted to work on Costa Rica in the 20th century. And so I convinced my department to hire him as a translator for me because my
Nice.
training is in French.
Oh,
And so learning Spanish was not necessarily something I could accomplish alongside writing this book. So he was like instrumental, and I think these might have been his favorite sources to work with for me because they're manuscript and they're early 19th century um, colonial Spanish
because
stuff. Great.
from this period in my own research, writing my own stuff and so on, I've mentioned off camera that I have these houses in a colonial town called Mompos on the Magdalena River.
Mm.
In order to write a book that I did and published in 2025, and it took me 10 years, but I didn't write a word through COVID. I couldn't pick up a pen or pencil. I think it was a depression there. But I ended up and I found a lot of the diaries of like former members of the British Legion who traveled the river,
Mm-hmm.
or travelers. And in fact, Consul Henderson from the US and so on, and all of these people who traveled down. And of course, beautifully written, when in an era where the people wrote so wonderfully, not just the cursive, but the descriptions. I think to
Mm-hmm.
me, that would have been really exciting to see the school children writing home. I mean, was there anything that sort of it shocked you when you read the translations going, wow, I wish my kid would write like this?
Well, mostly it was parents either complaining that their kids were becoming too Republican by being in the
Ah,
United States,
yeah,
like that the environment in New York City was too radical for them, or complaining that when they got home they were very skilled, but so they were very skilled at language and they were very skilled in their learning, but at the same time they like had global aspirations that didn't necessarily fit the places that they were going to. There's a really cool series of letters between one of the tutors that um, Velasquez de la Cadena had hired, who they fired, I think, or he left because he was teaching radical ideas of some sort. And he went to central Mexico. And so he was reporting back from working in a mercantile firm in central Mexico about what was happening there. So, they're just great letters.
yeah,
I got to work with diaries too,
yeah.
John Quincy Adams, not someone obscure at all, but the
No,
US president in this era has a fantastic diary and they have digitized it. So it's now keyword searchable. And so you can sort of figure out day by day what is happening in the US foreign policy because he was Secretary of State the early 1820s and then became president. So those diaries are really fun to work with. I found the diary of a surveyor. There's only one surveyor who makes it to the route in the 1820s. And his diary was fantastic. It's so much fun to read these old materials.
it really is, because it gives you a different, and also the minutia of what took place in what we now know as the Central American republics down there is
Mm-hmm.
so unknown. I think this about Colombia in itself, and I've written this in places, that so much of this history of that period, aside from sort of
Mm-hmm.
independence and Simon Bolivar and the key things, has been erased from the collective memory down here because of the conflict, the long-running conflict within Colombia. And I think, again, our imagination of Central America as well is one of lawlessness and the 1980s and all of the different conflicts and civil wars in that area, or the soccer war and the banana republics and so on. That we tend to have. I mean, we just don't have a real knowledge of how much interference from the north and from Great Britain as well took place in this area. And this was, for me, I never formally studied history past the age of 16, but it's been
Mm-hmm.
a passion of mine now, and then into my doctorate and elsewhere. But at school, I never formally continued it as an elective, but it's a passion for me to study it now. And it's just we would never have learned in the British curriculum in my childhood anything that the Brits did in Central America and South America, because it wasn't really seen as our sphere of influence. A little bit to the Caribbean, Jamaica. Yeah, really is more of that. And of course, we learnt about all of the heroic deeds of what they call here the pirates, but we call the Navy, like Francis Drake and the others. And then that's it. That is it. We talk about obviously the independence of the United States or your great Revolutionary War. We talk about those things, but we don't talk about what. And I know about Bluefields and I know about British Honduras, but the depth of the interference is huge. And I'm going to bring up something from the book, and it was on page 114, which of course very much appealed to me because it's about Colombia as well. And it says articles reported on several British commercial agents in Colombia pursuing canal contracts, but Simon Bolivar's government demanded British diplomatic recognition before it would consider awarding a contract to a British company. Citing its treaties with Spain, the British government refused to recognize any of the new Spanish-American nations. The plan for a canal through Panama stalled. And you're like, and I'm doing a study into the British Legion here and the British Cemetery in downtown Bogota. It's just a given in history and in conversation here that the Brits were on the side of the new Republic of Colombia. And therein lays something that I had no idea about. And now I will have to quote you in this next book. Were there moments, I've talked too much, were there moments where you were like, wow, these British agents or these agents from the United States or these Dutch agents, they were really dark characters.
Yes, I mean, I think at times I definitely thought about these characters as being, I would say, like multifaceted, right? Like there's elements of them that are incredibly human. They're dealing with illness and they deal with long time separations and all sorts of other challenges. But then at the same time, there is this sort of underlying power dynamic that is certainly concerning. I think the easiest characters for me to see as sort of villains in this story, and there aren't really villains in this story. I think everybody's very nuanced, but these predatory lenders in London, I think of them as loan sharks. They are just and real sharks are in this book too.
Yes.
So these are the loan sharks versus the actual sharks who swim in water. But they are kind of very predatory towards Latin America. And in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, which certainly I'm sure, although I studied at Oxford for a year, but I didn't study this period of British history. But I'm pretty sure the British curriculum covers the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, yes, very much so.
But after the Napoleonic Wars, there's this readjustment, really in global politics, because they had been global wars and global finance. And a lot of the money that had been being channeled toward the war efforts starts to move towards Latin America. That is like the frontier of investment in the late 18 teens and early 1820s. And the way to make money in these men's minds was not only to invest in things like silver mines, which they had seen Spanish wealth be generated from for centuries, but also in the financial instruments themselves. And so there is a series of different British bankers and investors who create these loans that really are just designed to channel profits to their pockets. And that happens throughout Spanish America with long-lasting results, like the debts owed to British investors linger into the 20th century. It's still being resolved, But the story of how that happens in the 1820s is particularly interesting, and it's relevant for this project because one of the targets of investment is a canal. Like seeing the possibility of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without having to go around the Cape and all of South America seems like such a commercial potential, globe-changing alteration to the structures of trade and empire that the British are really invested in that. And yet they have no data whatsoever. They have no knowledge of what is actually on the ground in the places they're thinking about. And you brought up Panama, but I want to also mention, like, there's three competing routes in this period. And I think of it as a kind of Goldilocks story. So there's the Panama route, but Bolivar, I think wisely, wants political recognition before he is willing to allow a canal to be built. And then in Mexico, they have this plan of a Tehuantepec Canal. But Mexico, as I mentioned earlier, is in a period of political turmoil. And so it's hard to negotiate. The countries keep changing. But Central America seems to be just right. And so they plan a canal around Nicaragua. It's the preferred route for most of this era, both because there's already a lot of water there. Lake Nicaragua is a huge body of water. There's a long river that connects to the Caribbean, and there's not much land between the lake and the Pacific Ocean. So it looks like an ideal spot for a canal. But also the newly forming Central American Republic is newly forming. And so they have a chance to sort of influence it at its origin. Excuse me. Yeah, I should mention too that Central America is also the home of the Miskitu Nation,
Yes.
which is an incredibly powerful indigenous nation that controls the Caribbean.
It's a fascinating thing because, of course, you have them controlling the Caribbean, as you say, the Bluefields area. We've mentioned sharks. I'll get into sharks later because there's another fascination of mine, sharks. But when you talk about loan sharks, well, who knew that the banks were like this?
Yeah, I mean, who knew?
Who knew? And of course, Colombia, I think, probably still continues to pay off loans to banks right now here for the recognition. It was, the British influence and the British interference in Colombia was not, this was not, what's the word that I always use? They had their interests. They had their interests in this. And of course, yes, the Napoleonic Wars is very much in our curriculum. Obviously, very much also painted as a great success for the Brits. And then you've got all of the soldiers and officers, and they're out of work. And of course, you've got this expansion. So it's a fascinating time that is overlooked a lot. And when you talk about these different canals, this must have been fun to look up in the newspapers as well. This is from page 103. You go, on August 23rd, 1825, the Times published a prediction that should the canal be made, Nicaragua would unquestionably be the richest and most thriving part of America, either north or south. The author described the new constitutional government as in equally glowing terms, concluding, there will remain no question of Guatemala being the most favored part of America. And I feel and also, here we go, and it continues. Moreover, the country was exceedingly desirous of standing well in the opinion of Great Britain. Isn't that just wonderful, that sort of thing? And it was just months earlier, the British government had finally recognized the sovereignty of Mexico and Colombia. So these are not, these are not altruistic plans at all.
No.
And you work a lot on the whole, your academia is a lot on capitalism and so on. And I can see you sinking your teeth into this because it is true. And obviously Britain still having a reputation as an empire at this period, so you want to be in good standing with the Brits. How does it then compare? You said that the canal contract in Nicaragua was given to like a company from the United States. How did they choose that over, let's say, a British company then?
So, yeah, that's a great question. There was a British agent in Guatemala City who was hired by a series of investors. He was a former Army officer or Navy officer, maybe Navy officer. And he traveled to Guatemala City before the real boom of agents from foreign capitalists and agents from foreign countries got there. So he was like the first legs on the ground. And they, for a long time, it looked like he was going to win the contract for this canal for his employers back in London. But the Panic of 1825, which is an enormous financial collapse, really put an end to his plans to get this contract. He continues in his career and surveys the canal, actually, a couple decades later, maybe a decade later. And there's an enormous map in the National Archives in Kew. It is just enormous. But the Americans end up winning this contract. Excuse me for a second. There's colds going around along with the snow up here.
That's fine.
So, yes, we had, here's what happened. The British agent got there first. Then the American agents start showing up, and there are multiple American agents. The U.S. takes a long time to get a diplomat to actually arrive in Guatemala City. They lose 2 to death along the way. The third one gets there, and some of the agents back in the U.S. try to convince him to put pressure on the new federal Central American government to award the contract to what they assume to be the only American firm competing, but actually there are multiple American firms competing, and the diplomat does pressure the government, and they award it to the wrong guy, which is a funny story. But the reason why the Americans are so appealing, the American companies are so appealing, there's 2 reasons. There's sort of an internal reason in Central America, which is the Central American government had tried to raise money through a loan on the British markets, but it arrived too late, and the Panic of 1825 happened. So they couldn't get an influx of capital that way. So the canal is the best way the federal government can think of to raise money for their new country. And so they really want a contract that will raise revenue. So that is a part of why they choose an American company. The other part is that Panic of 1825 part, which is that the London companies can no longer really offer the capital that they were promising just a couple months earlier. And so by the time the federal government of Central America is meeting to review the potential contract, they choose an American company because the British companies are no longer really a good option, but they don't do a whole lot of research. They just go with the one that seems like it's going to bring the most profit to the federal government. And that one happens to be a really interesting company because it's really only one person. So there's so much to this story. It's just so interesting.
So it's one person. It's almost like a shell company. It's almost
Yes.
what we'd call today a shell company. It's the original Panama Papers.
It is designed. It is the dream of this man, the same man I was talking about before, Aaron H. Palmer. And he hires a Polish-born Mexican revolutionary to go negotiate in Guatemala City. And this man, the Polish-born Mexican revolutionary, comes back with the contract.
Benedek or something?
Benesky.
Benesky,
yeah. Charles de Benesky, who went by many different names and changed his age all the time and changed his nationality regularly. He's a real sort of shifty character, but very fascinating. And Palmer, like, this is his dream to connect the world. And he tries to get the U.S. federal government involved. He doesn't succeed at that. Then he goes to the New York state government and gets DeWitt Clinton, who's the most prominent canal man in the world at that period. He's the Erie Canal sort of dreamer. He gets him behind the project. There's a lot that happens once that contract gets written and it comes to the United States. But the contest for the contract is mostly a competition between the British and the U.S.
Yeah.
And the British kind of shoot themselves in the foot because they have this giant financial crisis that ends investment in Latin America for a while.
I think there's something about the British shooting themselves in the foot that I can see cyclical here, but let's not get into that. I might alienate some of my listeners. I've got to this section here where I've marked it as well. Although the mission to the Panama Congress was a disaster, deadly for the Charge, politically poisonous for Adams, and unable to accomplish its purpose of hemispheric unity, the lengthy instructions Clay composed for the ministers provide insight into the administration's ideas about an interoceanic canal. And despite what he said to Palmer and Benesky, Adams and his cabinet disliked the idea of a canal contract between a country and a company. So it comes in, doesn't it? It comes in. The 1825. We might want to just put that the disaster, the financial disaster, the panic. Could you just put it into context a little bit for my listeners? What happened here?
Absolutely. So, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, investment is channeled towards Latin American investments. But the British industry also ramps up its production of textiles and all sorts of manufactured goods. Come the panic of 1825, come December of 1825, there start to be serious doubts about both the Latin American investments and some of the manufacturing choices. And the stocks and bonds that were rooted in Latin America start to depreciate in value very rapidly. And this soon becomes a classic financial crisis, um, with banks having to shut their doors and um, the stocks losing their value precipitously. People lost fortunes. Benjamin Disraeli lost his early fortune in this, and a lot of other sort of ordinary people lost their life savings in this story. But the loan sharks who had actually sort of made these bonds possible, and the people behind the potential Nicaraguan canal, they all survived just fine, which is, one of those stories that has a lot of ring in the present.
I see that. And this is again why I find it so fascinating, the story, because again we know nothing about this. And
Mhm,
yes, we hear about the panic of 1825, but it's mentioned as a footnote. It's kind of like
mhm.
a hangover post Napoleonic War period. That whole sort of an exhaustion of empire, and you can start seeing it. That's what we get taught, but that it has a foothold into Central and South America is entirely unknown. So I think you've done a huge service here, bringing it out for people like myself. Now I can bore my wife, because who's the only one who just about listens to me anymore. If let's talk about the canal a bit as well, because it's quite exciting to think. Okay, 1914. I've traveled the Panama Canal now 10 times. Because I work on a National Geographic boat that does the trip. I do this a couple of weeks a year, and every single time there's something I learn new, and every single time, if it's about modern engineering or something about a Roosevelt or whomever, I will learn something new every time, even if the environment. And now I'm looking at the map here of Nicaragua, which you've got, so Costa Rica and Honduras above and below. And so, in theory, the canal would enter in San Juan del Norte, known as Greytown. So that's that really marshy area on the Caribbean side. A sort of, I guess the Corn Islands are just a bit off the coast there, and so on. So it would have made for a sheltered entry, and then it would have traveled the San Juan River up to San
Mhm.
Carlos, where it meets Lake Nicaragua. Now, Lake Nicaragua is deep enough to be able to take sort of like deep water boats, or what do we know about it?
Well, I mean, areas of Lake Nicaragua are quite deep, but most of they don't know anything about
Mm,
this. I mean, I guess that's the interesting
yeah,
thing about the people that I am writing about is they
yeah.
have no idea how deep Lake Nicaragua is. There is no data on that. The Spanish had collected some survey data, but it was locked up in Spanish archives and not accessible to the people, the British and US investors who are interested in this project. And
Mm,
so, yeah, maybe,
yeah. I don't know. And then you've got, because it must be quite deep, because you've got that is it Isla Ometepe in the middle,
right.
right, with the
Yes.
volcanoes, which I
Hmm.
climbed many years ago when I was a
Cool.
young man and my knees didn't have problems and so on. So you go to San Carlos, and then it would have come out and cut through across San Juan del Sur, which of course became like a railway area in the Vanderbilt and so on. I mean, so very connected in the gold rush era, and it makes, when you look at a flat map, a 2D map, it makes perfect sense. But that's what they're looking at. They're not
That's
looking
right.
at, and that's what's so fascinating about it. And then if you think of the history of all of the different ideas connecting one side to the other, one of my pet enthusiasms, being of Scottish descent and ancestry from way back, is of course the failed Scottish community in Nueva Scotia and Nueva Edimburgo in the Darien area, which, when you think about how narrow that piece of land is, but incredibly hard to cross because of the Darien jungle and the rolling hills and everything else, maybe the Scots were 250 years ahead of their time setting up there. They just had something that comes up in your book, and we've mentioned a couple of times, the illnesses that just pervade this area. And that's something I come up with again and again, is that if everyone's families are dying, their wives, their children, and this seems to be something that comes up so much. But one thing I wanted to talk about, as we've been talking a long time now, is that you talk about the collapsing country of Central America, which again, another fascinating. How long did the Central American let's say country, the what did it last? This one joint.
I mean, it's formally ended by the late 1830s. So
Yeah.
at most, it's 15 years, but I
Okay.
think it's probably a little less. And it never really is a fully empowered government.
No.
The states within the federation are often at war with one another, at war within themselves. There's civil wars in this. I mean, Nicaragua is pretty much in civil war most
Yeah.
of this period. And within that government, Guatemala versus the federal government is El Salvador versus the federal government. There are, it is not a stable period, and the government is never entirely stable. In fact, it never has a really concrete name. I think this is one of those, you asked me before when I went, whoa, moments, is when I realized that the US recognized this country without knowing what to call it. So it recognized some country in Central America, and they didn't know its name. And also at the recognition, President Monroe and the diplomats from Central America, they don't speak any common languages. So it is an almost silent, and they didn't hire translators. And the US government wasn't big enough at that point in time that it just had on staff interpreters. And so, you just don't imagine a silent recognition of a new nation that you don't know the name. That's just wild.
I love that. And they don't speak. I mean, to trivialize it entirely, it's like English people going into a French bakery. If we just shout louder in English, they'll understand us. I get that feeling with the US government recognizing.
I feel like it's the same for the Central Americans. They're like, well, if we just make our case, if we just show up, maybe we will get this diplomatic recognition, which we really need to become among the powers of the earth, to become a country. So they get recognized as a country before they really form as a country, which is its own set of problems. But the US did the same thing during the revolution. So
yeah,
it's not that odd. It's the age of revolution pattern.
yeah.
But the story itself is really wild.
Well, I think so. I want to. I think it really is a fascinating story, and I've said that several times. And you write so well about it, because I mean it reads like a who's who. Yeah, there are characters in here, obviously those who are more prevalent than others. I'm interested, before we wind down, in knowing more about the Miskitu and Rama nations, because again, history is written by those that write, let's say, or sadly, as we say, the winners. What was going on with the original people of this area?
And also the dominant people of this area in this period. So, it's so funny because we all learn as we research. I think that is one of my favorite parts about writing books, is to get to learn new things. And I had to learn the history of the Miskitu and the Rama. The Miskitu are relatively easy to learn about because they were a major power in the Caribbean. They controlled basically from Honduras through Panama. And they collected tribute from indigenous nations throughout that region. The Spanish were never able to conquer them. They remained outside of Spanish laws. They traded with the British. They had a sort of interesting, complicated relationship with the British that lasted centuries. And the Miskitu dominated all the other indigenous nations that also remained unconquered from the conquest, which I guess as a US trained person, I never really realized that there were indigenous nations that survived the conquest unconquered. And so one of these nations that they dealt with, that they collected tribute from, lived along the San Juan River and they're called the Rama. The Rama now mostly live near an island in Nicaragua called Rama Cay. But back in the 19th century, the early 19th century, they lived along this river, and they were the ones who knew it. It was a very complicated river. It had a lot of sediment in the dry season. It had huge rapids. It also was like a very easy to navigate river in the wet season, except you had to deal with a lot of rain. And so they had the like on the ground knowledge, but they didn't have a ton of written documentation about them. It was very hard to research the Rama. I only found several secondary books, but not very much primary material, because they were unconquered indigenous people who lived outside of the sphere of English language and Spanish language knowledge production, and they guarded their knowledge, I think, to protect themselves in some ways. And so the Miskitu were not quite like that. The Miskitu were constantly in communication with Britain. In fact, the Miskitu king, and it's not quite a monarchy in the same way as a European monarchy because there's regional leaders that are very powerful. But the Miskitu king was Jamaican educated, had been to London. There several generations of the family had been to London. They spoke English fluently. He was a big fan of romantic literature. He read romantic literature, so he also read the British newspapers regularly, which is how he learned that the man that he had entrusted, Scott, named Gregor MacGregor, had actually double-crossed him in London. And instead of trying to gain diplomatic recognition for the Miskitu, had tried to set up his own country called Poye, which is its own separate story, really fascinating. But it's interesting to see this contrast between two different indigenous nations that both lived in the Caribbean side of Central America. And the Rama, I think, are really understudied as a topic because they lived along one of the most desirable places in the world in the early 19th century. And yet we know very little about them. I really wanted to bring them into this history, and to make sure that their experiences weren't totally left out of what is often dominated by the Central American Spanish descended peoples of the Pacific coast, who really controlled the power structures that were recognized by Europeans at that time. But there are power structures on the ground too. And the Rama and the Miskitu have their own fascinating story and their own relationship to a canal. The lack of a building of a canal is really a victory for them.
Of course. There must be a connection between that coastline as well, the Rama, the Miskitu, and then the Guna people as you come down the coast as well, who again were never conquered and of course defeated Panama themselves. It got the Panamanians to step down and are very guarded with their history. They don't want us really to get hold of it too much. It's their history, because we'll probably misinterpret it and write it as a victory for European colonizers. It's the final point. Then you talk about sharks. It's like your final point. There was a book written in the 1999, 2000, if I'm not mistaken, by a writer. He was a travel writer, but very good book called Wild Shore. No, not Wild Shore. Wild Coast or Wild Shore? Edward Marriott, anyway, was the writer. And it's all about the bull sharks. The bull sharks that can go up and down the river. And of course, it can't just be about the bull sharks. It has to be more about a modern take on Nicaragua and, of course, the smuggling and so on else. And so he gets into the history of bluefields and what have you. And it was when I was an undergrad and I wasn't reading my set texts and was reading other things that were of more interest to me, I read that book. And to date, that's 1999. I can remember it now in 2025, 26. It was a fantastic book about that and about the, again, more contemporary history of that area, and quite terrifying about the sharks. Quite terrifying. So I'm very glad you brought in the sharks, and maybe talk a little bit about not the lone sharks, the actual real sharks. So
I can talk forever about sharks. In fact, my next research project is on a history of animals. I teach a very popular history of animals course at the at UNH. Yes. And so the first part of that project is on these sharks, which I have done a lot of digging to sort of figure out. And having read the book, that when I say I did a lot of digging, I have done a lot of digging.
You have.
To figure out the history of how these sharks sort of their adaptability. So in the early 19th century, really in the 16th century, people are commenting on how there are sharks in Lake Nicaragua.
Mm.
And they were thought for a very long time to be the world's only species of freshwater shark. But in the 20th century, a couple of scientists from Harvard tracked down a specimen. It was very hard to get a specimen of Lake Nicaragua sharks. And they first sort of are the first ones to actually identify and classify Lake Nicaragua sharks in their own category. And then within a decade, those same scientists recognize them as ordinary bull sharks. And so the question is really whether they adapted to freshwater as a species. Was it a kind of Darwinian adaptation, or do they adapt individually, and can they traverse that really challenging river to get to the lake? And of course, we know now that the answer is yes, they can traverse the river to get to the lake, but they did not know that for a very long time. And so the man-eating sharks of Lake Nicaragua, they are throughout all of the records that I read of people in that region in the 1820s. And so I wanted to just know more. And the part that I find most interesting is both the adaptability of these animals and their survival in this challenging landscape, but also the adaptability of the thinking of the people. I think that's even more precious to me, is the way scientists can change their minds and we can change our minds as humans. And so I'm really interested in the shark.
That's so cool because, I would just think, well, you need to get in touch with the Rama people because they'll obviously know a fair bit about that. This is the book. It's called Wild Shore by Edward Marriott.
Thank you.
It's dated now, and it is journalism. It's not academia, but I remember reading it, and it was so good back in the day.
Yeah,
The author of this book travels up the course of the San Juan River from the east coast of Nicaragua to Lake Nicaragua to meet the fishing communities whose lives are led by their proximity to the bull shark. So there you have it. So
the shark fishery is collapsing.
Yeah.
I mean, it has been collapsing for a decade or more.
Yeah. Oh, well,
a rewrite of that book might be very
it will be dated because I remember he talks a lot about the shark fin industry and so on. So, but listen, this has been fascinating. I mean, we've jumped around a lot, and that's just testament to how much I enjoyed the book. So congratulations on this. I wish you all the best and a whole load of sign-ups for your new course on the history of animals. The next book is going to be a history of animals, I guess, then, or will you continue to do the biography of Palmer?
No, I think Palmer's done, although who knows, maybe in me at some point I will write I wrote 80 pages on Aaron Palmer and had to condense it down to 10. So I have a lot to say about him. But I do think the next project will be on a history of animals. I'm not sure exactly what shape that will take yet.
Cool.
But I started with these sharks. They're super cool. And
they are.
The history of Central America is not very well integrated into both U.S. and British history.
Not at all.
And so I think continuing to try to integrate Central American history into English language-based history is really important to me.
Listen, thank you so much. I'll just say again, I've been talking to Jessica M. Lepler, who is the Associate Professor of History at the University of New Hampshire. The book that we've been discussing kind of roundabout and largely is called Canal Dreamers, The Epic Quest to Connect the Atlantic and Pacific in the Age of Revolutions. Obviously, it deals with Nicaragua and Central America, but it's about US and British foreign policy as well behind it, and capitalism and this terra incognita, as you have it here on the blurb. It is captivating, and let me just say, I truly enjoyed it. My poor friends who are going to have to listen to me now talking about it, going, why do you go down these rabbit holes? Well, I love them. So listen, thank you again for your time and for sharing your knowledge and for writing this book.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me about it. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you.
You're
And
most
Happy New Year.
Yeah, we're most welcome. This is the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm Richard McColl. If you choose to support us, you can go to www.patreon.com/Colombia Calling, or just remember to hit subscribe after you've listened to one of these episodes. We'll be back in a week's time with more stories using Colombia as a lens for stories of interest around the region. And of course, to everyone out there, have a great 2026. Thank you and goodbye.